Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about the blog that we will be doing next week, where we are going to be responding to the Ada Limon and the Frank X. Walker packets, and looking at specifically how they use figurative language. So the link I had posted for the Module 1 assignment sheet talks about the different kinds of figurative language that writers can use. We're familiar with some or all of these, right? So like onomatopoeia is when words sound like, what they are, like boom, hiss, sizzle, those kinds of auditory words. Personification is when we make something that is not human, give it human-like characteristics, right? Like the tree is angry, or whatever. We're giving human attributes to non-human things. And there's imagery, simile, metaphor. So the link explains all of what those are. And what your assignment is going to be for blog number 2 is to look through the Walker and Limon's poems and find a couple instances where you see this figurative language being used. I just posted a link to Andrea Gibson's poem, Orlando, which is about the shooting at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, one of the biggest mass shootings in U.S. history. And it was specifically targeting a queer nightclub on Latin night. So it was specifically targeting queer people of color. So there's multiple intersectional layers of hate happening in this mass murder. So I posted the link that had her performance with the musician, and also the performance where it had the not the lyrics, but the lines of poem coming up. And I wanted to take a minute and show you this poem as an example of what I want you to do for blog 2. So in this poem, we don't see all these examples of figurative language being used, but we can see that she's using several of them all at once. So, for example, the link on figurative language talks about imagery. So imagery is anything that is, attaches to the 5 senses. So if we describe what something feels like, sounds like, smells like, looks like, that's a use of imagery. So we can see that in Gibson's poem, Orlando, where she talks about the beats of the song and how the people, the victims, didn't recognize the gunshots, right? So they didn't leave the dance floor when they heard gunshots because they thought they were just the beats of a song. So that sound and that feeling in the body in a dance club of very loud music is an image that she's using. The next line, she says, "Everyone around me spent that day grieving, and every tear tasted like someone's dance sweat dying in the morgue." So that idea of that salty taste of tears and things drying, we get that very upsetting image. The whole poem is very upsetting, and I had to finish crying before I made the video because it's very, very moving. Another example later on in the poem, when she says, "A rifle lifted over a bathroom stall and emptied a magazine into the kidneys of a grown man texting, 'Mommy, I'm going to die.' His handprints in blood on the wall, reaching for people." So this idea that we hear him say those words, "Mommy, I'm going to die." We see the gun coming over the bathroom stall. We see the bloody handprints on the walls. These are very vivid images that we're hearing, that we're seeing, that we're feeling in the body. So you see a lot of examples of that through Gibson's poem. She also uses hyperbole. That's one of the figurative language tools that the link talks about. Hyperbole is an exaggeration. We're not supposed to take it literally. So her line, when she's talking about how she's on stage and she's watching everything, afraid of another shooting, and she says, "Every few seconds I died." Well, obviously we're not supposed to take that literally, but she's so nervous. She's watching that the security guard isn't paying attention. She's looking at the guy fiddling with his duffel bag. So that's an exaggeration. That's a hyperbole. We're not supposed to assume that she literally died every second. We also see similes throughout here. Simile and metaphor are very similar. Simile compares things using like or as, which you probably remember from like your middle school English classes. And we see a lot of that through here. She talks about girls with hair cut short as my temper, right? So she's comparing the haircuts to how short her temper is. Wearing my best friend's hoodie like it was my boyfriend's class ring. So she's talking about she's got a crush on this girl. She's wearing this girl's hoodie, kind of like it's a class ring, like they're dating, like it's that marker of a relationship that hasn't happened yet. So we see simile throughout here. And there's also metaphor. At the end when she's talking about poems. So we keep sending up these poems. She says, talking about the poem, she says, they're just unanswered calls to people who claim their God, their apathy is unwilling to accept the charges. So, unwilling to accept the charges, this goes back to the day when we had to pay for long distance, right? And you'd call somebody collect, and, the operator would say, you have a collect call from John, do you accept the charges? And you could either say yes, and then the operator would put the call through, or you'd say no. And so this idea that we keep sending out these poems, and there are these unanswered calls to people that say that their God and their apathy is unwilling to accept the charges. So we keep sending out these poems asking for help, asking for communication and connection, and people are just not listening. They're not paying attention. So that's a metaphor. She's comparing poems to asking our communities and people for help, to care, to get involved, to do whatever. So she's comparing these two things, saying these poems are these unanswered calls. So when we look at figurative language in poetry in particular, it's one of the biggest tools. It's one of the most common. It's one of the most powerful, because there's a surface level to a poem. You can write a poem describing a dirty coffee cup. But how you describe that coffee cup could make that coffee cup be about your divorce or your heartache or your dream to be a nurse. You can make that coffee cup be something else. So there's the surface level of poem, and then there's everything that's under it and around it. And figurative language is one of those bridges to help us connect things and give our readers new and different experiences, to make that coffee cup be a divorce. So for blog number 2, I want you to maybe take one of the Frank X. Walker poems and take one of the Ada Lamone's poems. And you don't have to do every example of simile in these poems, but just pick out a couple. And or say, okay, I want to talk about this metaphor and I want to talk about that hyperbole. And tell us what poem you are writing about and where you saw this figurative language happening.